All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Wingo, Liaison Librarian for English Literature, Theater, and Romance Languages and Literature at Seulghee Library. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this roundtable discussion on We Have Been Here All Along, Gender, American Literature, and White Supremacy, which is part of Seulghee's Scholarship at Villanova lecture series and is being co-sponsored by the Gender and Women's Studies program, as well as the Department of English. Tonight, we celebrate the publication of Gender in American Literature and Culture, the latest addition to a new Cambridge University Press series that seeks to understand the cultural forces that have brought us to our vexed contemporary moment. Examining texts from early America to present the volume demonstrates how rigid inscriptions of gender have perpetuated a legacy of violence and exclusion in the United States. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Speakers at our virtual roundtable discussion will include the book co-editor and 3 contributors, whom I will now introduce. Dr. Brigitte Fielder is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is, along with Jonathan Seulghee, co-editor of Against Sharp White Background, Infrastructures of African American Print. Her first book, Relative Races, Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century America, was published by Duke University Press in fall 2020. She is currently working on a second book on racialized human-animal relationships in the long 19th century, which shows how childhood becomes a key site, often simultaneous, for humanization and radicalization and racialization. Dr. Travis Foster is an associate professor of English and academic director of Gender and Women's Studies at Villanova University. He's the author of Genre and White Supremacy in the Post-Emancipation United States, and the co-editor of the special issue of Legacy titled American Women's Writing and Genealogy of Queer Thought. He is currently editing the Cambridge Companion to American Literature and the Body, and working on a book about male femininities and racialization of gender. Dr. Jean M. Lutes is a professor in the Department of English at Villanova University. She is the author of Front Page Girls, Women Journalists in American Literature and Culture, and the editor of Around the World in 72 Days and Other Writings by Nellie Bly. Her most recent publication is A Queer Tale of Two Endings, Alice Dunbar Nelson's His Heart's Desire, in the spring 2021 issue J19, the Journal of 19th Century Americanists. Dr. Seulghee Lee is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and English Literature at the University of South Carolina. He currently is working on 2 books, Other Lovings, Queer Love Bonds in Black and Yellow, which examines love's presence and persistence in the theoretical contexts of racial melancholia and Afro-pessimism, and Oriental Menace, Anti-Asian Misandry in American Culture, which is the first study of Asian American maleness as an embodied site of racial misandric abjection and vulnerability. Thank you to our speakers for joining us, and thank you to all of you for being here. During the talk, we kindly ask that all event attendees keep themselves on mute and submit any questions using the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Now, at this time, I will turn over the screen to Dr. Lutes, who will lead the discussion and facilitate the question and answer session afterwards, if time permits. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. So, I want to thank everybody. I see lots of familiar faces, and that's really lovely. And I see also some faces I don't know, which makes me really glad as well. Thanks to everybody for choosing to park yourself yet again in front of your computers at the end of a long day in the middle of a really challenging spring in which the notion of spring break has been erased by our college and universities due to the pandemic. So I'm really thrilled to have a chance to talk to you all about this book today and to let you hear from 3 of the really extraordinary contributors to this volume. I want to take a minute before I talk about the book to thank Falvey Library and especially Gina Duffy, Falvey's Communication and Marketing Program Manager, who organized this event and who's doing important back-end work even as I speak, letting people in and monitoring. So thank you, Gina, for everything you've done. I also want to thank for co-sponsoring this event, the English department, especially my department chair, Heather Hicks, and the Gender and Women's Studies program, especially programming director, Melissa Hodges. Thank you. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge my co-editor, Jennifer Travis, who is professor and chair of the English department at St. John's University. And Jen could not be with us today. And she's definitely with us in spirit, and I just have to say a few words about her. She asked me to work with her in this project, so I'm indebted to her for inviting me on board. From the outset, this book is a fairly massive undertaking, and it was very much a collaborative process. I have come to realize at this point in my career, based on my personal experience, that academics in the humanities work too much alone. Some feminist scholars have always resisted the single author research model, but for most of my career, most feminist scholars I know, including me, write mostly alone. There are good reasons for that, I understand. But still, working with Jen to design this volume, to solicit contributors, to edit the contributions, and to co-author the introduction was incredibly rewarding. I definitely would not have wanted to do it by myself. Given the scope of the volume, I was so grateful to have a co-editor with Jen's vision, wisdom, experience, and good humor. So call it to Jen. I also wanted to call out two graduate students who may or may not actually be in Zoom, so I can talk about them quickly, but my research assistant, Zachary Richards, who has worked on multiple phases of this project, doing proofreading, fact-checking, regularizing citations, compiling statistics. He's been wonderful. And I also wanted to call out Caitlin Dittmeyer, the graduate student who produced the index for us. Indexes always matter intensely to researchers, but particularly for this kind of book, which spans 5 centuries and aims for a broad audience. Collaborating with Caitlin on the index reminded me of the demanding and weirdly fascinating intellectual work that indexing requires. I want to acknowledge the folks at Cambridge University Press, especially Ray Ryan, our editor, and Edgar Mendez, the senior editorial assistant, who has been there for us every step of the way. And now, before I start to talk about the book, I have to confess that this celebration is a tiny bit premature. The book is actually not out yet. Its official electronic release date is now March 25th, and it will publish in print roughly 2 weeks after that in the UK and Europe, because as Edgar Mendez put it in an email to me recently, we have to freight stock across the pond. The book will not be published in the United States until later next month. If you're feeling inspired, of course, you can pre-order it. But since none of you can get your hands on it at this point, I am going to post in the chat. Bear with me while I do this. I created a Google Doc with some screenshots of the cover of the book, the table of contents, and the index. So if somebody will y'all make sure, does that open up? Can anybody tell me, does that actually work? Okay, did, thank you. Thank you, Professor Lee, for nodding. So I included the, I thought skimming the table of contents along with the index gives you a pretty good sense of what the book covers and what it doesn't. It is not comprehensive, although it gives a substantial sampling of the variety and depth of gender-based scholarship in American literature. I know the font is especially small in the index, so I apologize to those of you who, like me, will need to squint mightily to read it. So I did the best I could. Now I just want to say a word about why Jen and I took this project on and what we hope this book might accomplish. The volume, as Sarah mentioned when she did the introductions, is part of a new series that Cambridge imagined as what our editor called a present-centered treatment as a response to the present moment and all it entails. Its audience is upper-level undergraduates, graduate students, and researchers, and it is designed to be both a reference that sums up critical thinking on gender in American literature and an intervention that offers the latest thinking on that topic. This is a real departure from Cambridge's typical academic series, as our editor acknowledged from the beginning. But Cambridge decided it was necessary, given the pressing need to better understand what has brought the United States to its current moment. The series was conceptualized in the first year of Donald Trump's presidency, and the American political scene was always very close to the heart of this book. The introduction that Jen and I wrote to the volume is titled Gender Criticism in the Age of Trump. Given that there are 21 essays in this volume, there is no way this roundtable can do justice to the brilliant work of all of our contributors. We could do this again next month, and the month after that, and the month after that. We could have a session on gender dynamics in Indigenous writings, on queer erasures and non-binary identities, on sexual violence and literary expression, on gender in the immigrant imagination, and so on. Yet our contributors do repeatedly return to whiteness as a problem, whether it's how ideas about white women's sexual vulnerability and sexual consent have propped up white supremacy from the early days of the nation. That's chapter 1, Anna Mae Duane. Or white women's complicity in their own confinement in the early republic. That's chapter 2, Marion Rust. Or the regimen of harm that white women have visited upon Indigenous people through maternal colonialism. That's chapter 9, Susan Bernardin. Or how in contemporary novels by veterans of the Iraq War, trauma insulates white men from accountability and underlies a newly authoritative version of masculinity. That's chapter 14 by Hamilton Carroll. I could go on. These are just a few examples. I took the title of this roundtable from the last paragraph of our introduction to the volume. So to conclude my remarks, so we can get to hear from our contributors, I'm going to read you a 3.5-minute excerpt from the introduction, including the last paragraph, before I turn the floor over to Professors Fielder, Foster, and Lee. Moving across genres and centuries, this book demonstrates how gender has structured American literary history and how rigid inscriptions of gender have perpetuated a legacy of violence and exclusion in the United States. The chapters go beyond inflexible categories of masculinity and femininity, and they offer nuanced readings of literary genres from early America to the contemporary moment. They treat gender intersectionally as a category best understood in relation to racial, ethnic, and class, and other identity markers such as religion, ability, age, sexual orientation. And they explore non-binary and gender variant identities, as well as a range of normative models for girls and women, boys and men. The chapters respond to a sense of cultural and political crisis, one that often finds gender at its center, by illuminating the literary histories and cultural imaginaries that have set the stage for urgent contemporary debates. The divisiveness of our current political climate and the renewal of white patriarchal nationalism demands that we reckon ever more directly with the treatment of gender in US literary and cultural history. Indeed, many chapters here ask an implicit question. What can the presidency of Donald Trump teach us about gender in American literature? Against political threats to families, homes, persons, and communities, we have seen a major resurgence of feminist activism and thought across publics and institutions. This book responds to that resurgence with chapters that are presentist and activist, but also keen to avoid overreaching. This volume was completed before the COVID-19 pandemic and the massive wave of anti-racism demonstrations that swept the nation and the world in early summer 2020, fueled by the disproportionate harms the pandemic visited upon Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and by the Minneapolis police murder of George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man. For many people across the United States and around the world, these events brought into sharp focus the racism and inequities at the heart of our nation's institutions, as well as the need to grapple with their representations in our cultural artifacts. Jen and I are confident that readers who wish to better understand how gendered models of white supremacy have flourished in American life and letters will find much to consider in this book. Many of the chapters interrogate the very injustices that inspired the reckoning of 2020. While we believe that understanding the cultural and historical operations of gender is more pressing than ever, we also recognize that a chastened model of literary criticism has emerged, one that is less confident in its transformative potential, more skeptical of claims to liberation, and more modest in its sense of what it can accomplish. Times like these throw the grand empty gesture into particularly stark relief. In this historical moment of retrenchment and doubt, gender, feminist, queer, anti-racist, and post-colonial scholars who have always professed a commitment to linking theory with praxis are confronting the limitations of criticism more directly and returning yet again to the time-worn question of why literature matters. The chapters in this book turn often to the dispossessed, to women writers, Indigenous writers, queer writers, and writers of color, because instructive literary histories emerge when we take a broader range of stories and experiences into account. Our contributors extol the value of ordinary feelings and self-care. Sorry, Sarah. Sarah was complaining about self-care webinars right before we started. So our contributors extol the value of ordinary feelings and self-care, the value of the fangirl author who circumvents the publishing industry, even the value of the non-linear fractured temporalities of writers with dementia. While charting the optimism of recovery and the expansion of US literature, these chapters also reckon with renewed expressions of hegemonic white male power. Rather than promise the fundamental transformation of literary history, this book urges continued inquiry and offers more cautionary tales than shattering revelations. To the question, how did we get to this explosive moment in our national culture? These chapters answer, we have been here all along. And now you will get to hear 3 of the contributors talk about their amazing contributions to the volume. And first, we will hear from Professor Fielder, whose essay is chapter 12 in your table of contents. So I will turn the floor over to her.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Great. I'm very grateful to Jennifer and Jean for including me in this volume and for this conversation today. I'm actually going to read aloud an excerpt because I'm very eager to share with you some of how 19th century African American women writers' work resonates in the present. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's 1869 anti-passing racial uplift novel, Minnie's Sacrifice, traces the failures of white feminism, failures that resonate for us in the present. An anti-nostalgia novel treating slavery, disenfranchisement, and lynching, the most sustained critique that Harper gives is not of extreme white supremacy, but of a more moderate position indicative of mainstream white feminism. Critiques of white feminism are not unique to Harper. The moderate racism of white women's abolitionists and suffragists, for example, has been well documented and by 19th century writers. But Harper's subtle and accurate descriptions of failed white anti-racism are noteworthy in their brilliance and for their continued familiarity given the prominence and longevity of such failures in US social justice movements. My contribution focuses on one of her most complexly and brilliantly constructed characters, Camilla LaCroix. Camilla is the daughter of enslavers, and though convinced by abolitionism, her decision to free one of Harper's protagonists and have him raised as her white brother begins the novel's plot. Despite Camilla's kinship with and knowledge about Black people, however, her attempts at solidarity remain mediocre at best. She is perhaps Harper's most insidious white woman character in her pretenses that mimic allyship, but fall disappointingly short. Via Camilla, Harper illustrates moments of anti-racist possibility and failure, or what I might term refusal. What I characterize as failure here is not passive, but willful, similar to the phenomenon that Robin DiAngelo describes in White Fragility as, quote, not a weakness per se, but a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. These failures' lost potential disappoints anti-racists while strategically lowering expectations. White feminists sustain mediocrity, deceptively miscategorizing failure as allyship, solidarity, and friendship. Women like Camilla are poised to look like models of anti-racism to viewers who cannot identify with Black people or prioritize Black perspectives. Caretha Mitchell notes the easy slippage between white anti-racism and its failure, showing, quote, how often white mediocrity is treated as merit. Harper's fiction is reflective of her experiences as a Black woman in the anti-slavery, women's suffrage, and temperance movements, where she encountered countless similar failures of white womanhood. Like her better-known novel, Iola Leroy, Minnie's Sacrifice displays her nuance for writing characters who depart from polar representations of white villainy or sainthood. But the bar is low for white women enslavers, and Harper crafts a character who might cajole some readers, into viewing her as an ally. Women like Camilla prioritize their own interests, claim positions of victimization, and foist labor onto Black people. These failures of any real solidarity exhibit the mediocrity masquerading as merit that Mitchell acknowledges and ought to be addressed not only for what they fail to do, but for what they pretend is sufficient. Camilla displays Harper's ability to read these nuanced strategies of pretense and as they refuse to work outside their own interests and towards any structural rather than individual change. The rest of my time, I want to just briefly highlight some of the examples in this novel that illustrate some of these tactics that Camilla employs. Many Sacrifice begins with a depiction of white feminist failure. Her first chapter introduces Camilla, the daughter of an enslaver, Bernard Lacroix, who has apparently, unbeknownst to his child, raped an enslaved woman, Agnes. Agnes has borne Lacroix's child, and she has died. Agnes's mother, Miriam, grieves her daughter, and she is then beset by the whims of the white child who calls her Mammy. As soon as Camilla arrives to confront Miriam, she takes the opportunity to signal her own virtue by doing so, telling her, "I've just got back this afternoon, and as soon as I heard that Agnes died, I was hurried to see you. I would not even wait for my dinner." Pretending altruism, Camilla nevertheless centers herself. Throughout this opening scene, we see larger patterns of white women's and girls' treatment of Black people. Although Camilla claims that Agnes was our friend, at least I know she was mine, she seems to know little about this woman. As she exclaims, "Why, I didn't even know Agnes had a baby." We see that she lacks important information, and readers learn that Agnes had, quote, fallen victim to the wiles and powers of her master, and the result was the introduction of a child of shame into a world of sin and suffering, for herself an early grave, and for her mother a desolate and breaking heart. Camilla's response to this news repeats a familiar model of uninformed white saviordom. She decides to free Agnes's child, Louis, and have him raised as her own brother, pretending he is white. In the narrative that follows, we read two stories of interracial adoption, both Louis' and Minnie's. While Louis is raised by his enslavers, Minnie is also a white-presenting child of a white enslaver and an enslaved Black woman, and she's raised by an abolitionist Quaker couple in the North. Ultimately, both Minnie and Louis discover and embrace their African-American ancestry, they marry, and they move south to do Black uplift work. At the novel's close, Minnie is lynched by white supremacists in retaliation for Black suffrage activism, and Louis is left to mourn her and to continue the work. Before Louis meets Minnie, it is Miriam, Louis' grandmother, and not Camilla, who tells him the truth about his Black genealogy. Just as he's about to join the Confederate Army, Miriam stops him, saying, lest he lift his hand against his own people. And in the scene in which Miriam reveals Louis' Black genealogy is illustrative of Black women's inequitable burden around conversations about race. Camilla's strategy is avoidance. Though troubled by Louis joining the Confederate Army, Camilla is oddly not a Confederate. She is unwilling to act, and she foists this labor, unsurprisingly, onto the older enslaved woman. Wholly ignorant of how to help him, she knows nothing of Black people beyond their enslavement, and she leaves them with the responsibility of dealing with racism's aftermath. Despite her sisterhood to this child who is, quote, just as white as anybody, Camilla does not know how to be a sister to a Black man. That Camilla herself is not a Confederate is an odd but brilliant point of Harper's characterization. She resembles not only the Southern belle in her continued ties to slavery, but also Northern white women in her anti-slavery and pro-union sentiments. Her position is not extreme, but moderate. Martin Luther King Jr. describes his position in his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, calling the white moderate a greater barrier to Black freedom than extreme racists, noting that, quote, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than the absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Like the Alabama clergy of King's address, Camilla is someone who paternalistically believes that she can set the timetable for another man's freedom. And she is not exceptional, but ordinary, a centrist adjacent to white anti-slavery advocates. Mitchell notes the importance of such ordinary, middling positions for assessing whiteness, noting that, quote, manufacturing innocence and manufacturing merit are best appreciated when one looks at ordinary white people, not extreme examples. And in Camilla's moderateness, we see the danger of manufacturing either innocence or merit. She is not innocent of slavery. Her pet scheme for one mixed-race Black child deserves only partial credit, and this complicity in racism is equally applicable to modern Northern anti-slavery women activists. Abolition is significant, but it is not to be conflated with anti-racist activism. And one need only look to the afterlife of white women's anti-slavery activism to comprehend these failures of racial moderacy. The contradictions inherent in Camilla's enslaving, pro-union, ideologically, though not practically anti-slavery amalgam presents a phenomenally rich commentary on white womanhood. Harper shows Southern white women who so resemble Northern white women that the latter's difference from the former is difficult to discern. In just 1869, Harper is well able to depict a white woman whose supposed anti-slavery position is nevertheless suspect. As she addressed the National Women's Rights Convention in 1866, she noted the danger that white women posed to anti-racist social justice. At the convention, she explained, quote, "While there exists the brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America." These airy nothings and selfishness would hinder the translation of Northern white women's anti-slavery advocacy to post-war anti-racist advocacy. And as soon as a perceived competition with their own privilege arose, articulations of advocacy were revealed as false platitudes. Camilla's racism is similarly selfish, moderate, and ordinary. Harper's image of white feminist failure is a foreboding, a predictor of Reconstruction's failures that white women abetted by refusing solidarity with Black people, and especially with Black women. One waits throughout this novel for Camilla to do anything truly noble, to transform herself into an ally, to approach the rare position of radical anti-racism from her position of kinship with the novel's mixed-race protagonists. But she does not. The closest she approximates is a passive, insidious, and familiar trope of white womanhood, a woman who expresses her disdain for slavery while never countering it beyond her treatment of one individual. A white woman who claims a single Black family member or friend, and whose only social encounters with Black people are with those light-skinned enough to be taken for white. Her greatest expression of allyship is hosting her white-presenting, white-raised sister-in-law and treating her cordially enough to care about the danger of her murder. This is the image of white women that Harper presents in all its insidious pretenses towards racial justice.
Thank you, Professor Fielder. That was amazing. So I'm going to give the floor to Professor Foster.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fielder. That was great, and some synergies between that talk and this one. And thanks too to Jean and Jennifer for including me in the volume. I feel so lucky to have been a part of it. And thanks to Falvey, Sarah, Regina for helping to organize. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that worked. And I'm going to start. So this contribution came at a fun time in my kind of research career, where it's a hinge between the book project I just finished and the one I'm about to start. And my talk today tries to set that up a little bit by talking briefly about the kind of observations that my first book had about white supremacy, and then thinking through how this particular chapter that I wrote was an attempt to think about how those might operate when doing a history of male femininities and sort of queer male gender expressions more generally in the 19th century. So I'm going to start with the kind of the concurrent phenomenon of whiteness and white supremacy, and then I'll shift to the focus of my chapter. Let me see how to do this slide. Okay, there we go. So as Sarah mentioned, I recently published my first book, Genre and White Supremacy in the Post-Emancipation United States. A main through line in that project is the limitless capacity of whiteness to incorporate intra-racial differences and conflicts. When presented to challenges from within, from within whiteness to its hegemony on the status quo, white supremacy absorbs and incorporates. So for instance, my book tracked the white supremacist incorporation of white feminism, which Dr. Fielder was just talking about, of white socialism and white radicalism, of European immigration, and of white psychic descent from the nationalist pressures to belong. Many others have charted similar histories and histories that are kind of germane to the second half of my talk today. So queer and trans studies critics like Jasper Puar and Lila Lavender, for instance, have charted a homo or transnationalism in which white neoliberal inclusivity reinforces of queer and trans subjects, reinforces white nationalist projects like US and English imperialism. And just to kind of take an example of that, this is why, and this is a recent example, recent attempts by white gay male couples to hijack the Proud Boys hashtag fell so flat politically. The participants in this hijacking believed that homosexuality alone would separate them from white supremacy, utterly ignoring a long history of inclusion, of queer inclusion within white supremacy that predates even the invention of gay as a distinct identity category. For my talk today, there are two key effects of white supremacy's incorporative strategy that I want to focus on. The first is that white supremacy, while on its face a kind of simple notion of racial hierarchy, domination, and subjugation, has reproduced itself by stacking dense networks of complexity and paradox into its modus operandi. We might see white supremacy as a bold affront to Occam's razor, if by that phrase we mean that explanations gravitate toward what is most simple and least multifaceted. Rather, whiteness boasts of its own complexity, its own paradoxes, its own violations of the principles of logic and reason through which it judges and racializes non-white others. White Americans frequently celebrate the most famous line from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself," as a testimony to individualism and nonconformity. But we also know that Whitman was both a white supremacist and a white nationalist, and the line serves just as well as a braggart's motto that white supremacy uses to broadcast its own privilege to violate the very rules that it demands others follow. The second effect of white supremacy's incorporative strategy I want to focus on is that whiteness has managed to operate as a rare system of belonging that expands to accommodate a flexible range of behaviors, identities, and beliefs of those it claims as its own. We know that all belonging requires a certain level of discipline over its members, and my claim is not that white supremacy doesn't exert such pressure on whites. It's rather a matter of degree and sequence. Time and again in American history, white supremacy opts to expand and include before it disciplines. This facet of whiteness, I would argue, is in no small part what white America celebrates when it celebrates freedom and liberty. So it's in part this history that made me so interested in researching the effeminate man. I want to first provide some background to this figure who I've come to understand through a range of descriptions in US newspapers and medical books, in political tracts and humor, both visual and verse, and I'll show some of the visual humor in my slides, and through the case study of Ichabod Crane, the protagonist of Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And these are just some of the kind of newspaper clippings that I used. So as the newspapers progressed, newspapers and magazines developed a clear portrait of a figure they categorically dubbed the effeminate man. In the process, they transformed him into what one 1840 dictionary named a, quote, complete specimen of person. Reading through these accounts, we learn that the effeminate man, quote, is often in the kitchen and continually in the nursery, frets tiresomely about his health, is vain, bedecks himself in jewelry and fine clothing, quote, is great as a connoisseur in ladies' dress, avoids politics, is suspiciously good at committee work, quote, for a school feast, a flower show, or the like, quote, is dull and vicious in the society of men, and yearns for the company of women, for nothing pleases him more than to be the only man in a room full of ladies. He is, moreover, quote, much out of the beautiful order of nature. This is because his abnormal gender expression degenerates his very physiology and will indeed, quote, effeminate his spermatozoa and his offspring will be deficient in stamina, making him the worst possible candidate for the reproduction of the race. As a specter signifying the threat of white racial suicide, as a perverse violation of the balanced complementarity between men and women, and as a trespasser into domestic spaces rightly belonging to women, he and his kind, quote, are looked upon as social monsters, and it is well known that they do little to advance society to a state of true order. And these are some of the kind of humorous images that circulated of the effeminate man in the century. The effeminate man thus emerges as a key case through which to assess the incorporative capacities and limits of white supremacy. In many ways, the effeminate man would seem to be unassimilable. His emergence within the 19th century was taken to be a sign of the degenerative effects of over-civilization that had taken hold, leading whites as they saw it, precisely through the comforts and privileges of supremacy, to become weakened as a population, hence the kind of association between the effeminate man and racial suicide. Simultaneously, his entrance as a domestic laborer into the tasks and settings carved out for women constitutes an invasion, interfering with the patterns of domesticity through which white gendering occurs. And indeed, the vitriol and hostility directed his way within such a wide range of white American writing suggests that exclusion remained the primary white tactic for dealing with the effeminate man's very existence. Yet, and this image may be familiar from your Disney watching, Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow also demonstrates the lengths to which white residents of the town of Sleepy Hollow will undertake in their attempts to make room for Ichabod Crane, the effeminate stranger in their midst, welcoming him as their school teacher, as the director of their church choir, and even as the fireside caretaker of their infant children. In one key moment, Irving elevates Crane as an exceptionally graceful dancer surrounded by an audience of Black servants who look on from the windows outside, and Crane depicts their kind of minstrel caricature. Not only does the scene offer a textbook example of Hortense Spillers' argument that Atlantic world slavery excluded Black men and women from domesticity and hence from gendering itself, it also highlights how even white queer gendering, effeminate men say, or masculine women, could be incorporated into privileged positions atop white supremacist hierarchies. Only when Crane's courtship of the town's most sought-after single woman threatens to succeed, thereby inserting the effeminate man squarely in the patrilineal path of white biological reproduction, does he become persona non grata, leading to the story's ambiguous conclusion where he is violently evicted from town or more likely murdered. So I take no clear takeaway from this multi-layered meeting place of gender deviance and white supremacy. And I think the lack of a clear takeaway is precisely the point. So let me close with just a couple of speculations. The first is that those of us who occupy marginalized positions from within whiteness, white queer and trans folk, white disabled people, white poor people, to take some examples, can and should call upon our experiences as footholds for interracial solidarity. But those solidarities require careful analyses about how we ourselves have been incorporated into white supremacy's capacious embrace. And second, thinking of anti-racist strategy, perhaps the most effective route to dismantling whiteness in all its wiliness and flexibility and complexity won't be through overly subtle, reformist, or to kind of take one of Dr. Fielder's terms, moderate measures, but rather through the kind of unwavering and single-purpose, blunt clarity that we see in the inspiring abolitionist movements of today, particularly those focused on prisons and the police. And because this is an event focused, sponsored by a library, I'll just drop a book recommendation at the very end speaking to this latter point, which is Miriam Kaba's recently published We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Foster. That was amazing. So I am going to give the floor to Professor Lee.
Sure. Uh, Thank you so much, Jean, for putting this event together, and I appreciate you and Jen including me in this wonderful volume. Really excited to be a part of it, and thank you to Sarah and Regina for putting this event together and for all the logistical support. Uh, like Professor Foster, actually, this essay provided an opportunity for me to pivot between research projects, and my first book on the love bonds that cohere with the ontological turn in Black studies, as well as psychoanalytic approaches to Asian American racialization, coincided with a new subfield within the Black radical tradition that came to my attention and has become a research area since, and that field is known as Black male studies. And its text, published in 2017, which I haven't been able to really put away since, is Dr. Tommy Curry's The Man Not Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, published by Temple University Press in 2017. And the publication of this volume has not only generated a lot of new thought in racial misandry studies, but launched its own book series in which my new research project will hopefully align. And so the cover of this book, of course, includes George Stinney, who is believed to be the youngest person ever to be executed in the United States. And he was executed in the city where I sit right now in Columbia, South Carolina in 1944 at the age of 14. And with that emphasis on premature death and victimization and vulnerability, Black male studies offers us a way to think about Black maleness, Black manhood, and boyhood as sites of violence and victimization and vulnerability. And so one of the ambitions of my essay for this volume is to think about what Black American literary reflection has had to say in conjunction with some of the philosophical aims of Black male studies. But I just wanted to read, in the spirit of getting some words out from the essay, a block quote from Dr. Curry's introduction that I included in my essay. And this kind of gets at the philosophical bearing and ambition of what Black male studies has to say as a field. Because maleness has come to be understood as synonymous with power and patriarchy and racially codified as white, it has no similar existential content for the Black male, who in an anti-Black world is denied maleness and ascribed as feminine in relation to white masculinity. If whiteness is masculine in relation to Blackness, then Blackness becomes relationally defined as not masculine and feminine because it lacks the power of white masculinity. Thus, Black maleness is in fact a degendered negation of white maleness that is feminine because of its subordinate position to white masculinity, but not female because Black maleness lacks a specific gender coordinate that corresponds to either white maleness or white femaleness, and as shown later, relates to the white female primarily as rapist. And so this description of what the degendered negation of Black maleness designates in our symbolic order is a riff on Sylvia Wynter's work on how man and the construction of humanity is divided not by gender, but rather by genre. And so the notion that the interruption of the coordinates of man and woman and the inscription of European male privilege and power as the primary forces of anti-Blackness, of white supremacy, and that gender thus functions as subordinate to race and racialization therefrom. And so that's one of the bearings by which we can describe anti-Blackness and what Dr. Curry describes as an anti-Black world in the context of all the other work that has permeated from Black studies in the last 15 to 20 years that can be described as the ontological term. Professor Foster already mentioned Professor Hortense Spillers' work and on the access to gender that is already precluded to the cargo of the slave ship. You could think about Saidiya Hartman's work on racial and sexual violence in the archive of slavery. And you could, of course, also think about the landmark text published just last year of Frank Wilderson's Afro-Pessimism that is, that serves as the the new apotheosis of that whole school of thought and tendency of philosophy. And so the literary texts that I mentioned or that I closely read in the essay are Ishmael Reed's Reckless Eyeballing, published in 1986, and then Keith Lehman's Heavy, an American Memoir, published in 2018. And what I say about Ishmael Reed is that his work about the description of Black men as an endangered species is totally coincidental with the rise of certain vectors of powerful second wave white feminisms in the United States. And he put this content in a satirical novel in the mid 80s in order to establish these points about how it is that second wave feminism has actually buttressed and sometimes animated by anti-Black misandry. And actually, in fact, Ishmael Reed himself just published an article yesterday in Tablet about the reception of this novel, coincidentally, and how it was received poorly or dismissed by academic critics who are, working to think about what is precluded by and what it should not be included in discourses of feminism, including Black feminism. And then lastly, Lehman's work, he is the kind of leading thinker and writer on Black maleness as a site of vulnerability, including sexual vulnerability. And his realist account, because it's a memoir, discussing how it is that Black genderedness, when it comes from the position of Black boyhood, actually resembles something like what I would call anti-Black misandry, rather than a fitting in of given gender roles that are racialized. It actually suggests a phenomenological content that has little to do with given notions of gender. The other things I'll say is that I believe that this is the first essay to talk about Black male studies in conjunction with Black literary studies. And why I believe that's important is because one of the controversial elements, but also historical correctives of Black male studies is to discuss the potential complicity of Black feminist literary discourse in anti-Black misandry. So one thing that I point out in the essay is that Toni Morrison, Gail Jones, and Alice Walker, each of their first novels thematized pathological Black male violence against women. And so if you think about what Ishmael Reed was saying in the 1980s about these authors and the way that the Black women authors were so eager to throw Black men under the bus and propagate stereotypes of Black men as violent rapists, The Bluest Eye, Their Life of Grange Copeland, and Corregidora all revolve around this axis of anti-Black misandry. And so that's one way to think about the work that this essay does in terms of Black literary history. And then lastly, what I'll say is, I tend to think of Black male studies as in conjunction with the more radical vectors of the Black radical tradition operating right now. It's adjunct to and often coheres with radical Black feminisms, specifically given that the work on genre by Sylvia Wynter, even though Wynter herself had a very vexed relationship to what she called to Black feminist discourse, because her philosophy has been mostly taken up by thinkers in the radical Black feminist tradition, there are lots of rhymes and coherences between Black male studies and radical Black feminism, Black queer studies, and Black trans studies that have yet to be sutured and revealed. So that's in part what the end of the essay suggests. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. So I think our three speakers have given us a tremendous amount to think about. And they've all addressed relationship between race and gender in really compelling and really different ways. I want to invite the audience, if you have questions, we do have time for questions. You can post them in the chat so we can see them. I think that's what Sarah told us to do at the beginning. So I'd be happy to then field them to see if anyone has questions. I also did promise Professor Fielder, I warned her that I was going to ask her to consider talking about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, because I know she writes a lot about kinship, and was really fascinating. But I want to let you all talk first. I want to let you ask questions about to see if anyone has anything they want to ask our contributors about their essays. I'll give you a minute. It was a lot to process. Well, I can start. So I'm happy to ask questions. I'm interested in all three of you addressed in different ways the question of moderation and radical transformation, and the way the white moderate is invoked, and then the way that the model of the capaciousness of white supremacy is discussed, and how that fits, and how maybe only a radical transformation is possible to push to really change things, and the promise of a radical Black activism, and especially with the critique of white feminist thought and Black feminist thought. So I'm interested in what all three of you have to say about where you think in your work you see the place of, you've kind of said, but I would like you to give a chance to say a little bit more, to spell out how you think your work tells us today about what we should learn from these. And you spelled it out some, but I want you to say again more directly the question of white moderates and Black radicals. I think I'm interested in that. So I don't know if Professor Fielder, you wanted to start, but since.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that, one of the things that's really striking to me in writing about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and I'll try to also answer this question that's in the chat about white moderate women more culpable than white male moderate counterparts alongside this, in part because I have another essay in a different place about Harper's writing about white men in a sense. But I think the critique of moderacy that is available in early Black women's writing is really still kind of under theorized or under discussed. And this is in many ways because of the ways that Black women's writing has been dismissed as moderate, misread, pretty deliberately misread by some top male thinkers like Du Bois. Really criminal obituary for Harper is one example, I think, right? That a closer examination of the wide spectrum of critique in early Black literature, especially, gives us a much more nuanced picture of what racism looks like in ways that I think might otherwise get framed as a more recent nuanced view of what this looks like. But these critiques of moderacy are very well available. I think some accusations of certain kinds of moderacy among Black women, especially ideas about aspirations to whiteness or something like that, don't bear out with actual close readings of these texts. I've read a lot of very bad readings of Harper in some very, very early work on some of her stuff, and I think that we're really kind of just starting to open up a broader spectrum of looking at this kind of writing, and this is where I think some of these questions about genre might come into play too, right? That like by looking at these questions, we also can kind of change our ideas about what we're looking at, what kinds of texts these are. And I think that gives us a kind of broader scope for thinking about, women's writing more broadly.
Thanks. Thanks. Professor Foster?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, this question makes me think about what are the argumentative and rhetorical forms that moderation takes? And I think that really goes back to the way that whiteness is so kind of reliant upon complexity, right? Moderation we think of as just like staking out a position in the middle, but it's also kind of compiling and rearranging arguments from quote unquote both sides. But when you're talking about this both sides when it comes to white supremacy and racism, then moderation is ultimately kind of a paradigmatic instance of whiteness making itself complex in order to reproduce its own hegemony as a kind of supremacist identity and supremacist like set of institutions. And so that's why I kind of closed with the blunt clarity of abolitionism as I think a kind of a source of inspiration for present day activism and thinking in the face of hundreds and hundreds of years of white supremacy in this country.
Professor Lee, I want to give you a chance to respond to that question before I go to the one in the chat. So.
Sure. I mean, just one way to coalesce the two sets of comments prior, and definitely in Professor Fielder's wheelhouse more than mine. But one of the things that Black male studies has drawn my attention to is the fact that what was once considered progressive and decidedly not moderate white feminist discourse was actually animated by the psychosexual threat of Black manhood and Black maleness. I live down the street from one of the monuments erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy that has yet to come down. And so one of the things to think about, right, is the fact that WKKK organizations had a role to play in women's suffrage movements at the turn of the century. And so this is one of the ways in which gender discourse and gender criticality, even in the 21st century, need to be closely examined for their complicity within anti-Blackness.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Lee. I want to ask the question that Jenna Marca posed in the chat. I'll just read it so that we can all hear it and invite the speakers to respond. For all speakers from a pedagogical perspective, I found that my freshman comp students, she tells us, are generally on board with in-class critiques of overt extreme white supremacy, in part because they're able to see themselves as distant from that. Do you have any tips about introducing the sort of insidious presence of white moderation, the paradoxes of whiteness, to borrow from Dr. Foster, in the classroom when discussing racial violence? Oh, sorry, she corrected. We understood your point. That was a great question. So. Anybody?
I mean, I straight up, I teach a predominantly white institution. I teach students who have zero experience with Black literature in general in most of my classes. And I straight up ask them to, make comparisons between 19th century texts that we're reading in the present. One example, Seulghee, is that, the critique of early white feminism that you give, and the critique of the violences of early white feminism is pretty readily available in Black women's writing from before Ida B. Wells, even in how we think about how these writers are talking about who the real sexual threat is in any of these situations. But I think that making the connections between past and present an actual part of what the goals for the class are is really not, my students never have trouble making those connections. I only teach stuff before 1900 for the most part in Black studies classes, and there is always too much material available from just now that my students can find resonances. And those resonances aren't just extreme examples, but they're subtle. And I like to give them those really subtle examples as, like questions on exams and stuff. Tell me what's wrong with this thing, using anything that we've read all semester. And they're able to make those connections in ways that I think are really productive, that allow them to transfer those reading skills to, the phenomenon that they're seeing in, contemporary moments.
I totally agree with that. I'll say that one thing I've I found success with is kind of take these historically white institutions like Villanova University and look at the language that they use to talk about themselves, especially when they talk about themselves in regards to race. So at this institution, using some of Father Peter's emails in the wake of different acts of kind of white supremacist murder, for instance, and kind of thinking about why different events are described in the way that they're described has been particularly useful for me in order to kind of highlight the ways that being a historically white institution really informs the way that the institution presents itself along the lines of white supremacy and anti-Blackness.
For those non-Villanovans, Father Peter is the president of the university. So.
Well, Jenna and I work at a predominantly white university that was founded in the smack dab middle of the Haitian Revolution. So I try to teach my students here what it means to be on a campus that was built by enslaved hands while there was a successful liberation effort, a revolutionary effort in this hemisphere of the first Black Republic, post-emancipation republic in the modern world. And then the other thing I would say is, with regard to Professor Foster's and Fielder's fields of study, and then encroaching into the 20th century, I always like to remind my students that the majority of the progressive Black intellectuals of their day, the so-called founders of Black studies like Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois, they were firmly rooted in the belief that knowledge and correct information regarding Black achievement and Black history and Black culture would be the antidote to anti-Black racism. So if only the white folks knew how human Black folks were by way of an accurate pedagogy, then the system of anti-Blackness would erode. And obviously that has not proven to be the case throughout the long 20th century. And so that's something to think about, that the kind of the Black liberal project of furthering our epistemic knowledge of who counts in the genre of man, right, to use Winter's language, has actually not been, it was a noble and admirable project from the vantage of, the 1920s, for example. And it seems like 100 years later, we're reckoning with the failures of that kind of knowledge project.
So I got sort of a stealth question, which I think is a good one though, so I'm going to read it out to everybody. In feminist discourse, at least after post-structuralism, patriarchy is often detached from individual agents. It's characterized as a systemic discursive phenomenon. And I'm wondering how, as a contemporary theoretical formation, you think white supremacy compares. Does that matter for political activism? Anybody want to take that on?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, here, in fact, I'll just post it in the chat too. It's a pretty long question, just a second. It's about patriarchy, comparing patriarchy as a systemic discursive phenomenon to white supremacy as a systemic discursive phenomenon. There, I put it in the chat.
I mean, in some ways, this is a question about intersectionality, I'm thinking, or how these things come together. I mean, that too would be, a more contemporary theoretical frame, but I would say that, much earlier than that kind of framework is adopted in those terms. Black women are writing about the ways that they know that, these, not just in their relationships with individual people, but also in terms of larger structures of oppression, that race and gender are coming to bear upon them, in particular ways. And this is, I think, something that really does matter for political activism in terms that it matters for political activist strategy. this is something that comes up in the ends of Midi Sacrifice in a really interesting way. Midi Sacrifice is published in the Christian Recorder, which is the official newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So this is a Black newspaper, Black edited, predominantly Black writers for Black people. So Harper's not writing for white people in this novel. She's writing for Black people, and she's writing and she writes a novel in which a woman who is white looking, who is raised by white Quakers, who is educated in the North, who is doing racial uplift work and doing really all the right things, gets lynched. So none of these markers of respectability save this woman from this this situation of violence, and that is the reality for her community. But this is not just about this one individual. This is not work that she alone is doing. There is this work is going to continue in the Black community in various ways. She also does another interesting thing with regard to how the novel treats the conversion of white racists. And that is not the responsibility of any of the Black people in this book. These people leave their white families and they go and live in a Black community, and making white people better is just not their responsibility. That's a project left to white people in this book. And there are white people who are kind of positioned to do this in different ways. There's, people like Camilla who are probably not going to get any better, but there are other better people in the novel who are, I think going to take up this work in a particular way, which is really interesting. But Harper's pretty deliberate in her books about parsing out the labor of political activism in racialized and gendered terms. And that's a project that takes into consideration these larger structures, but also happens in the realm of individual conversations and relationships to one another when, say, Black women are talking to Black men about the fact that, like, look, we backed you people for the vote. When the debate about the 15th Amendment came up, we knew that you would have our interests in mind better than white women would, but we still need the vote, and we are not gonna, us relying on our husbands for this is not sufficient. And so you need to now back us in this additional fight. And we know that we're not gonna rely on the white women's suffrage movement to do that work, because they're doing, as you said, like this other racist, project. I mean, the whole split happens. Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton go and campaign with an actual white supremacist, to support against the 15th Amendment. And so, the multiple levels at which this work is happening, I think, is always something that people are in, who are in the actual middle of this conversation, are aware of, and they're aware of it in these complex terms, even though they're not necessarily kind of tying this together in ways that are theoretically visible to us. They're definitely visible to us, I think, in the form of literature, especially, where we can see how all of this stuff plays out.
Anybody else?
I have an indirect way to get at the question a little bit, and it's been a pressing query in my research and teaching areas, in part because of the popularity of figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates in the popular press, and then in part because of the popularity of Afro-pessimism and Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton's thought in the academic theoretical realm. The idea that anti-Blackness is absolutely immutable and permanent. That's not exactly the same question as saying how it can be challenged discursively from interpersonal or individual agents. And yet it seems like a pertinent way to kind of get at maybe the question of how political activism can proceed. And that is, I mean, I think it has to be the thing that animates the Black radical tradition always has been the possibility that another world is possible. So any of the theorists that I've mentioned will always say it is indefinite article and anti-Black world, all the way back to Frantz Fanon. And so one way to think about, right, the supposed or putatively immutable character of anti-Blackness and white supremacy is to start thinking about how we train ourselves to think about its mutability. And so that's been a crucial feature of all the things I study and the way that I study.
Thank you. I got another question, and I think I can I got it posted directly to me, but I think that I'll read it to you and then I can post it in the chat too. But Professor Foster, did you want a chance to respond to that question about white supremacy and patriarchy? You don't have to, I was just giving you the option.
No, I think those responses were great.
Okay. I have a question about, this question says, I have a question about the final image on which Travis's paper ended, which was presented, if I'm understanding correctly, as an image of radicalism that has transformative potential. Critiques have arisen of what has been described as the bourgeoisification of BLM and the place BLM has come to hold in white identity politics, in white liberals' presentations of self. So my question is, how do we keep radicalism from being mainstreamed and becoming a form of moderation? Here, I'll post that to everybody so you can hear that, so you can read it.
My last image was the book cover, but the image before that I was using as a way of kind of just challenging white people who are using our own experiences of minoritization kind of from within whiteness, white queer people, white trans people, white disabled people, white poor people, as foundations through which to kind of imagine solidarity, interracial solidarity. It was meant to be kind of a challenge to that. And so that was explaining the image. But I think to the question, what I would do is I want to separate mainstreaming from moderation. And I think the goal needs to be to find the conventions that precisely can mainstream radicalism. And that would be kind of where that's where my hope would kind of fall, because it's through the collectivization that happens very frequently through convention and not against convention that that radical change can occur. And I guess the one example I give that references the previous question is cancel culture, which I think is this kind of amazingly effective genre at doing precisely the kind of sophisticated work of connecting individual and systemic culpability in white supremacist institutions in ways that previously had been kind of too complex to kind of convey in simple kind of like readily accessible terms that we've all come to kind of understand and even expect. And I think that kind of like making into a genre of a radical possibility like cancel culture is precisely what has so many racists kind of scared right now, and why there's this backlash against cancel culture, and also the sort of place where I think the mainstreaming of an anti-racist agenda might occur. I don't know.
Does anybody else want to talk about that question? Westerly? Yeah.
I mean, one thing I would say is, and I hesitate to even say this because some of the folks who are on the ground doing that work under conditions of duress are, students of mine and or former students of mine. But I do believe that by the time that Black Lives Matter enters mainstream discourse, especially in the way that it's positioned by the media, it's actually lost its radicality altogether. And there's a historical rhyme occurring between 2020 and 1969, 1970, where the fundaments of Black power as a movement, as a slogan, were actually to propagate Black capitalism more than anything else. So you have, Soul City, Floyd McKissick, that got its nice write-up in the Atlantic and retrospective recently, right? You have all these different iterations of how, right, the Black radical liberatory slogan gets co-opted almost immediately. So one thing I would say is, if Jeff Bezos is out here saying Black Lives Matter, I'm not sure how much, right, that slogan has for us left in terms of a kind of liberatory potential.
Professor Fielder, did you want to comment on that question?
I was thinking more of what Travis was saying about moderacy, but also in his talk when he discussed the kind of complicated nature of white supremacy. I think like the word that you used that I really appreciated was contradictory, and the ways that racism operates in you know, kind of in odds logically with you know, multiple claims. Colin Diane says something like this when she talks about racism's illogic, and you know, I think there is something kind of similarly contradictory about, you know, the idea of the bourgeoisification of Black Lives Matter, right? That, like, you know, that, you know, requires unpacking of, you know, what the complex pieces are at hand there, right? So like, is this, you know, the you know, the middle class person who has the Black Lives Matter sign on their lawn, but, you know, also you know, works at an institution that hasn't hired a Black person and does nothing about that? Or, you know, do they, or are they voting under supposed economic interests, you know, that they imagine, rather than, you know, voting for, you know, the kinds of social and political change that they think would benefit people who are in positions of unpower relative to them. And so I think that, like, you know, the question of those contradictions and what the, you know, the complexities at hand in this phenomenon that we're describing is the thing that really needs more attention, rather than just like, is Black Lives Matter useful in the mouths of you know, certain people, certain things, like in the mouth of a billionaire? Like, well, you know, the thing at hand is actually that, like, there's still billionaires, and maybe billionaires aren't a thing that we need, you know, like what does it mean to be a billionaire? If you're going to say Black Lives Matter, like, being a billionaire is not, is like contradictory to that articulation. I guess that's kind of like how I would understand what is wrong in this.
So I got one question that brings us back to the question of racial and gender binaries and literature, asking about Octavia Butler. I put it in the chat. What would you say of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, both of which reach, to some extent at least, beyond racial and gender beyond racial and gender binaries? I wanted to give you all a chance to have a reaction to that question. This will probably be our last one, and then I'll give you a chance if you want to say anything else. I've violated my rule already. I never really want to have a Zoom meeting that's longer than an hour, and now we're going on an hour and a half. So everyone who has stayed, you are doing a great job. Wow, paying attention. So, but does anybody want to take up that question about Octavia Butler and imagining reaching beyond literature, reaching beyond racial and gender binaries? Nobody does? Are you all tired too? Just like, so. Okay. So I can just,
I'm not gonna say anything. It's been like at least a year since I read Parable of the Sower, and many more years than that since I read Parable of the Talents. And I can't remember how they violate gender binaries. So, I mean, I remember, yeah, I remember really liking Lauren. That's all.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that bold effort there. I appreciate that, Travis. Okay. Then I think I should probably thank you all for taking on some really important topics in some really fascinating ways. And I want to thank everyone for coming to listen. I think that these three scholars are an example of everything that is right about my profession. And I think there are a lot of things that are wrong about it. So I just want to thank you all for doing the work that you do. And I want to thank everyone for listening. And I wish you all courage and resilience and grace as you move toward the end of this long spring semester. So thank you, everybody, for coming. So, and you can all go. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye.